Let's go. Well, g'day everyone. Welcome to week number 19 here on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge. If you are watching these videos live, then it is the first week of June, of course, which in Australia means it's the beginning of winter. Honestly, feels like the middle of winter at the moment, hence me wearing a jacket indoors, okay? But secondly, of course, no matter where you are in the world, this weekend is Pentecost Sunday. So big, happy Pentecost to you. And let's see this week whether you can discern in the narrative of what we're reading a bit of a Pentecost parallel, okay, in what we're reading. This week particularly, the narrative is focused on the construction of the temple and what happens at the end of that temple when it's constructed. Well, I'll leave that to you to enjoy as we get to that part of the reading. As is often the case, we're going to be reading narrative this week, of course, focused in on both Kings and Chronicles, a lot of repetition there. We're going to be reading 7 Psalms and then a whole bunch of Proverbs as we focus in on the life of Solomon. As I mentioned last week, spending 3 weeks on Solomon. Well, this week we're headed into week number 2. So let me start with the Book of Proverbs. Essentially, I have split the Book of Proverbs in our readings over those 3 weeks, not because it adds to the chronology or anything like that, but I thought reading the whole Book of Proverbs in 1 week would be a little bit dull, to be honest. So I've tried to just break it up over those 3 weeks and help us grow in our wisdom and try to take as much of it in as possible. So let's have a look at the Book of Proverbs before we step into the narrative and see what unfolds this week in the storyline of the scripture. All right. Well, last week we read about Solomon, of course, who is world famous for his wisdom. If you ask anyone about King Solomon, what he's known for, wisdom would probably be top of the list. We saw how that really began in earnest with a dream, God encountering Solomon in a dream, asking him, what would you like from me, basically. Solomon asks for wisdom and God blesses him. That's followed immediately by the story of the 2 women who are fighting over a baby, this classic tale of Solomon demonstrating this wisdom. And then particularly in Kings, it has this great closing passage summarizing the wonders of Solomon, basically saying he's the wisest man ever to have walked the earth and was wiser than all the kings of the east, etc., etc. Well, it also says there that Solomon, in his wisdom, wrote 1,000 songs, or over 1,000 songs. He lectured basically on all things wildlife, animals, plant life, birds and fish, all that kind of thing, right? And the other thing he was known for was authoring 3,000 Proverbs. Well, we don't have all of those Proverbs in our Bible. If we did, this Bible reading plan would probably have to go for an extra 2 weeks just to read all them. But we do have hundreds of them in the Book of Proverbs. And here's a basic structure of the Book of Proverbs I think would be helpful to get our heads around as we read Proverbs over the next 3 weeks. All right. Proverbs is basically, the Book of Proverbs anyway, is basically an anthology of wise sayings, or sayings of the wise, you could say. So an anthology basically means it's the greatest hits, okay? So Book of Proverbs can also be called, wisdom's greatest hits, something like that. And there's basically 3 sections. The first 9 chapters 1 through to 9, which we did last week, are basically poems, 10 poems, I believe, written by Solomon himself, okay? And what you've probably noticed is, particularly at the start, it's very much sets the tone of a father-son wisdom exchange, okay? This is a father writing to his son, a father sharing wisdom to his son. In fact, even as Solomon introduces himself in the opening epilogue, he doesn't introduce himself as King Solomon, ruler of Israel, okay? He introduces himself as Solomon, son of David. So it begins with that very much that family feel to it. And so that's what we're reading here. We're reading here primarily Solomon, yes, as a great ruler and king, but it's also Solomon, the father, who is aware of all the complexities of family life. And particularly if you grew up in a family like David, okay, you need wisdom for life. Okay, so Solomon is trying to share that wisdom with his sons. And one of the ways he does that in a very creative way is not just give fatherly advice, but he personifies wisdom as a lady, okay, as the voice of a woman, okay? And this may come, as I kind of suggested a couple of weeks ago, about his mother Bathsheba seemingly being quite a wise woman, which may also play into the very last chapter of Proverbs. I'll mention that in a moment. But basically, the voice of wisdom being a woman's voice, the voice of a woman guiding you through life. And it's almost as if he says that this lady wisdom, that the woman wisdom, was there with God, almost like God's wife, okay, as they partnered together in creation right at the beginning. All right. Now, again, this is just an illustration, but it's basically his way of saying, look, the two are one. When you hear God's voice, you're hearing the voice of wisdom. Okay. When you are following the voice of wisdom, you are following the voice of God. Okay, so Lady Wisdom, God working together, he sort of, like I say, personifies, which means he develops this character called Lady Wisdom, and that's sort of how you're supposed to read that in that form of poetry. Well, that's the first 9 chapters. We covered that last week. From chapters 10 all the way through to, where is it, chapter 29, okay, so the bulk majority of the book of Proverbs is basically hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of classic one-liners, okay? They're wise sayings from Solomon and other people showing us how to apply wisdom to basically every area of life, to family, to friendships, to politics, to leadership, to sex, to finance, to health, to your relationship with God, okay, etc., etc. And basically it's a collection of general truths, okay? They are wise sayings that are supposed to be easily remembered, so you can recall them quite easily. And that's why they often use the power of contrast, good and evil, light and dark, wise, unwise, or the wise, foolish, etc. There's this contrast thing going on. But basically they're designed as general rules for life. They're simple and they generally apply to life. Now, not every aspect of life you're going to have a proverb that matches it necessarily. And some of the proverbs actually seemingly contradict one another. Okay, I think it's in chapter 27, somewhere around there, we come across 2 proverbs that are listed one after the other that basically say the opposite thing. Okay, you're like, well, hang on, which one's true? Well, they're both true, but it takes wisdom to know which truth to apply in which situation. Okay, because while truth is always objectively true, wisdom is more nuanced. Wisdom is taking the objective truth and knowing how and when to apply that truth. Okay, and we know this as you watch people in life. Just because they get more educated and more intelligent doesn't mean they get more wise. You can be a real smart person, but not a wise person. You can be an intelligent person, but not wise. You can be clever, but not wise, because wisdom is about applying truth, and that's where it's not about just having the facts. Just give me the facts, ma'am. No, you need facts, but also the discernment to follow the voice of Lady Wisdom in situations. So I hope that makes sense. When you're reading these one-liners, these proverbs, they are not, promises from God to keep in your promise box and to say, well, Lord, your word says this. Well, hang on. That's a general truth that generally applies in life, but you need Lady Wisdom, voice of the Holy Spirit, okay, to know how to apply that. So anyway, bit of pastoral advice there. That's not what I'm here to do, but anyway, that's the main bulk of the book of Proverbs. And lastly is these, we shift gears next week in the last 2 chapters of Proverbs, where again it gets back into poetry. And these poems are credited to a character called Agur, who, whether he's a real life character, we don't know. There's no other historical record of him. Maybe he could be a fictional character. We really don't know. And lastly, a character called Lemuel, and where he shares poetry that his mother taught him. Okay, so the book basically ends with the wisdom of a mother to her son. Just like it begins with a father to his son, so the book ends with the wisdom of a mother to her son. And some people actually believe that this last character, King Lemuel, is actually King Solomon. It's actually a nickname that his mother gave him. So he basically finishes the book of Proverbs by sharing wisdom from Bathsheba. Okay, that's one theory, that this is the wisdom that Solomon received from his mum, not from King David, but from his mum. I'll leave that to you. It's neither here nor there, but it is really helpful, because as you read the last chapter of Proverbs, and I mentioned this in my book, You Can Handle the Truth, it is always helpful to have some idea of the author and the audience that is in play. Okay, so as we read the Wife of Noble Character poem, that Wife of Noble Character poem about what all the great qualities of a good wife, okay, that wasn't written to a daughter. It wasn't written to a potential wife. The wife of noble character poem was written to a son, and it was written to a son by his mother. It was the wisdom. As you read that, you're supposed to hear a mother's voice talking to her son, talking about the bride that he should be worthy to find. Okay, I mentioned that in my book, a bit of a plug there, but that's the whole idea. Even though we may not really know who King Lemuel is, at least knowing it's a woman's advice to her son helps us read and understand that last poem well, but I'm jumping ahead of myself because that's next week. Anyway, that's the Book of Proverbs, collated by Solomon, one of many books and many things that he is credited with writing, or certainly at least collating. All right, which brings us this week to the narrative. This week we're reading Kings and Chronicles, as we've been doing for a while. We started, remember, reading Samuel and then Chronicles. And a lot of copying and pasting there, but little bit of a different perspective from Chronicles. Well, we're now in the situation where we're reading Kings and Chronicles, very, very similar. The chronicler is there with Kings right in front of him, and this week you're going to find he's doing a lot of copying and pasting. There is a lot of repetition between the two, but don't skim over them, all right? My suggestion is you read Kings first as a bit of the raw data. This is how it happened, and then later in your week, read Chronicles. In fact, you may want to do all the Proverbs in between to give your head a bit of a break, and then read Chronicles as a bit of a refresher as to what was in the Book of Kings. I'll leave that to you. It's entirely your call. But essentially, there's 4 things that we see unfold in the narrative this week, all to do with the construction of the temple. Firstly, preparation. Solomon prepares for the temple. Basically, David, we already know, has taken up an offering, so he's prepared somewhat financially. Well, we see Solomon prepare materials that he needs, or at least people to provide those materials, and also a labour force, thousands of people to help out in the construction. Then we see the construction. The temple basically takes 7 years to put together. The thing is huge, okay, and it lists a whole bunch of the main materials there, timber and stone, and a whole bunch of gold and bronze. This is a really expensive, fancy pants temple. Don't think it's a cheap, church construction in a hay shed somewhere. No. This is a magnificent complex that he has built. Took 7 years. And with that, or after that, he also built his palace precinct, which was adjacent to it. Then after that, we have the dedication of the temple. Big gathering of people on a public holiday. He basically used the Feast of Trumpets as a way to get everyone there. And it ends up with a 3-week holiday, okay, celebrating the temple. And then lastly, the 4th thing we see is manifestation, okay? Preparation, construction, dedication, then manifestation, habitation. God himself fills the temple. The cloud of glory comes, and God's endorsement rests on this thing. And as I read it this week, it kind of reminded me, well, it very much reminded me, I'll mention this in a moment, about how similar it is to Moses' story. And I think it may have been God's way. The same way he manifests at the sanctuary of Moses when that was finished construction, so he manifests here. And it may very well be God's way of saying, as I was with Moses, so I am with you, Solomon. Remember he said that to Joshua? As I was with Moses, so I will be with you, Joshua. Well, this might be a similar thing. The same endorsement of heaven that was on the tent in the desert is now the same endorsement from heaven that is on the temple here of Solomon. So you're definitely going to notice that, the similarities between both of these two constructions, all right? In the Moses story, when Moses built the tent, God spoke really clearly. We had all those chapters, do you remember, in Exodus of this is how you're going to build it. Do it like this. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, very clear as to the purpose of the tabernacle. This was a place for God's people to meet, and was to demonstrate something of who God was. God is holy. Okay, hence all the washing and the fire and the animal sacrifices. That's the purpose of it. Well, it's the same with the temple. Okay, God spoke clearly to David. We don't actually see much of that speaking, but we do see it emphasized that Solomon is doing what God had said to David to do. God speaks to Moses, now God speaks to David with specific instructions as to how to build these things. So very, very similar there. In both situations, we have the leader then inspiring the people to get involved, to contribute, to give financial offerings as well as participate. Moses does that in the desert, gets the people involved financially, and so now does Solomon and David. We saw that last week. We'll see that again this week. The third thing that happens that's very similar is the dedication. Moses, of course, prays, urges the people to follow the covenant and dedicates the sanctuary. Well, Solomon does a very, very similar thing here with the temple. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, we see God's endorsement. Fire and cloud come upon the tabernacle. Well, this week, fire and cloud come upon the temple. So there are many similarities, and even to the point of the construction. Solomon and David very much design it after the tabernacle. It's just a heck of a lot bigger, okay, and a heck of a lot more expensive. This is a permanent structure, remember, not a tent, but it still very much has those three sections: the outer court, the sanctuary itself, okay, and then the most holy place. So the outer court, the holy place, the most holy place. It has that three-tiered approach with the furnishings that are all the same. However, a lot heavier, a lot bigger, a lot more expensive now that it's permanent and in the temple. So you'll definitely notice those similarities. But probably what got my attention the most this week, and I want you to see whether it raises an eyebrow for you as well, was the dedication service. Okay, the dedication of the temple. Here with Solomon, we basically, as I mentioned before, have a 3-week extended holiday. Okay, it's not all that clear in Kings. I sort of saw it in Kings, and I'm like, hang on, I was trying to do the math and work out how it worked out. And then I read Chronicles and it spelled it out clearly. Okay, it's another reason to read two, a bit like the Gospels, right? You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and one doesn't really give the full picture, but the other one helps to do that. Well, Chronicles really did that for me this week, as we have essentially a 3-week celebration, all of Israel coming to Jerusalem for the consecration and dedication of the temple. It was a massive, massive, massive deal. So I noticed that this week, the importance of reading both books. I also noticed this week how in the temple, Solomon brings both Moses' way of worship and David's way of worship and makes sure that he endorses both. All the sacrifices of Moses brought into the temple, but so, as we knew was coming, are all the singing and all the dancing and all the musicianship of David. That is now absolutely cemented as part of temple worship. But the last thing I noticed, of all the great stuff that's happening this week coming, the other thing I noticed this week is that the possibility of old covenant curses is still very much looming over God's people. And so as you see, just as we saw Moses with the tabernacle, okay, when he says, if you obey, God will bless you, but if you disobey, God will curse you. In fact, I prophesy he will curse you and you will be scattered throughout the nations. Remember that? All that depressing stuff there in the Torah? Well, here with Solomon, it's quite similar. With all the positivity and all the wonder and all the glory of what's happening with the dedication of the temple, you pay close attention to Solomon's prayer where he says, Lord, if God's people turn from you, but then they pray, would you answer their prayer? When they turn from you, please forgive. When they turn to you, please respond. When they disobey, please respond and bring them back. So even then, it's very much an if God's people do this, then please respond type of situation. This is the covenant that they are in. And so while, as I said, we are very much in the golden days of Israel's power and the golden era of Israel's prosperity, it's not going to last for long. Okay, I hate to break it to you, but it's not going to last for long because they are very much still in this old covenant system of the blessing of God, largely contingent on them obeying and being loyal to his covenant, because if they disobey him, curse and judgment are going to come. All right, don't want to jump ahead of ourselves, but basically we're going to be getting there in a few weeks, don't you worry. Finally, I'm going to put a link below to a really helpful video I found on YouTube this week that basically is a visual walkthrough of Solomon's temple. Okay, sometimes honestly, like Moses' tabernacle, all the measurements and the dimensions and all that kind of stuff, it's a little bit hard to picture. So people have put it together in a 3D animation, fantastic, really makes things simple. And the one I'm going to list below here also contrasts the sanctuary of Moses with Solomon's temple, so you'll be able to see that visually. So please check that out. I think that's just going to really help you in your understanding. Hey guys, long video today. Apologies for that, but still a very significant event as we see the Temple of Solomon constructed. This is going to play a major part in the narrative to date. In fact, as we know, in Jesus' day, the temple, or at least a refurbished edition, was standing. So it's a very, very significant part of the Bible narrative. Bless you guys as you read this week. Stay warm during winter. Happy Pentecost, and I'll catch you next week. Bye.